with us this morning to review the papers are broadcaster Pete Price and author and academic Joanna Williams. There they are. Hi, good to see you again, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. Joanna, you pulled out a story in The Times to start with about the risk of school closures as families flee the cities. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story, which I think really highlights how our demographics are changing in the UK. So it's essentially city schools which are at risk of closure. Now, if we'd been talking about this 20 years ago, it would have been small rural schools that were at risk of falling rolls and closing down. But it just shows that over the course of the past 2 years, two things have been happening in conjunction. There's been a decline in the birth rate, and then during lockdown, families moved out of cities, if they were able to, it seems, moved out of cities to smaller towns, countryside places where they could perhaps have a bigger garden, more chance of being out in the fresh air. So the result is that schools in inner cities, particularly in London, they're highlighting, are now at risk of closure. You know, I guess it really makes me think about the future if this trend continues and what this tells us about cities. And to my mind, it would be a very sad day if families were to leave cities altogether. I think it would make cities more unfriendly, potentially more at risk of crime and antisocial behaviour. And I do think it is important that we make our cities welcoming places, even for families with young children. I think it would be a shame if they became kind of ghettos where children weren't welcome.
For sure. And Pete, you've picked out a story in The Observer, of course, as we've been seeing these appalling scenes of sewage on Britain's shorelines in the south of England, certainly. There's a story in The Observer on page 2 that some of the country's water bosses earn 5 figures in second jobs.
Absolutely unbelievable. And I've got to quote this. Most people would be astounded that pay levels for CEOs are set by committees of other chief executives. I mean, these guys are playing games with people's lives. Concentrate on the one job, please. Get it sorted. 1 trillion litres is lost in leaking pipes. Wouldn't it be better to put all your energies into one job instead of going after all these other jobs with eye-watering fees? Oh my word, eye-watering fees. You've actually got to read this article because you couldn't quote most of it because you'd sit there in disbelief. You'd have to have 2 cups of tea. And by the way, the beaches up here around the Wirral are beautiful.
Oh, they certainly are. I love the beaches up there, Pete. And I think for many, it's shocking that water companies are making so much profit anyway, let alone their executives having second jobs. And on to the NHS, Joanna, you've picked out a story in The Telegraph about a former NHS chief having lost faith in the system. Why was that?
Well, I have to apologise to Pete's blood pressure because this is another story which actually, well, certainly made me very, very angry indeed. It's a former NHS chief, a sad story really as well. Rob McMahon used to be an NHS chief in the Leicestershire district. Sadly, back in I think March 2020, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but was told he wouldn't be able to have the biopsy that he needed for 3 months. And obviously he was able to do some research himself and found out that if he left this for 3 months, it could be fatal. He might not still be here today. Luckily for him, he had the £20,000 necessary to pay for these tests to be done privately. But what a shocking indictment of our system that the NHS chief himself, you know, cannot get the tests he needs. I mean, this is just awful, unbelievable. But I've got to point out, and this is something which becomes very apparent if you read this story in the Telegraph today, this is not a question of money. Normally when we read about problems in the NHS, it seems to be that there's a lack of money at source. he was told very clearly, it seems, by his NHS local authority that the priority was COVID, and the NHS was essentially closed for business. Now, those aren't my words, those are his words, the NHS chief's words in this article, that the NHS was closed for business, the main priority was COVID. My worry, and the thing that makes me so angry, is how many other Rob McMahons are there out there? How many other people had this diagnosis of cancer 2 years ago but didn't have the £20,000 and the wherewithal to know how to go about getting private tests?
Certainly a concerning insight, Joanna. Let's lighten it slightly. Pete, you pulled out another story in The Observer. We've all gone mad for fantasy blockbusters, apparently.
We have indeed. We have Game of Thrones, we've got House of Dragons, Sky Atlantic tomorrow. But what is exciting about this, and what is great, children are now discovering more and more adventurous books and science books, and it's bringing out a whole new genre of books, which is great. The Last Unicorn was published in 1968, and nobody's heard of it. Children now have discovered it again. So what the blockbusters are doing, which is fabulous, is bringing out the publishing companies with new books. And I'm sure there's some fabulous children out there also could write fabulous books like this and become blockbusters on TV.
And Joanna, you picked out a nice, slightly lighter story as well in the Telegraph too, about Napoleonic reenactors, people who like to reenact historical battles, that, you know, different strokes for different folks, but even they're being hit by Brexit, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I'm laughing, but you're right. If people are into this historical reenacting, then this is a very, very serious problem for them indeed. So on the Spanish-Portuguese border in a fortnight's time, there's supposed to be a reenactment of a Napoleonic battle taking place. But the people who do this kind of dressing up and go and do these historical reenactments are very concerned that they won't be able to get their weapons through customs, thanks to post-Brexit border checks. Some of these weapons, I didn't realise, are kind of replicas of historical weapons, cost about £1,000 a piece, and they're very concerned that the customs officials might confiscate them and they won't get them back. So, I mean, it's a bit kind of light-hearted, I guess, in the grand scheme of everything else that's going on in the world today.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid.
The people concerned.
They're going to have to wield pitchforks instead, apparently. Thank you both very much. We'll see you in a moment.